Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the early Middle Ages, right? And where we left off in the class, we were talking about the Viking Age, right? So, like, literally, something that you'll have to understand is that this era in time, right, the Viking era of European history, is literally an entire era. Like, I'm going to drop a couple of videos down in the description below if you want to actually watch and learn a little bit more about them. Totally not required whatsoever. It just seems that several of you were kind of interested in the Vikings and stuff like that, and the things that they did and all this other different stuff, their culture, right? We talked about the fact that they bathed once a week, which they were considered like clean freaks by most European standards. We talked about also the Lindisfarne raid a little bit, talked about them, but in general, right, you need to understand like who they are, okay? So if you want to watch those extra little videos, knock yourself out. If you want to look at videos of Viking longships and Viking warships sailing up the Thames to take over huge chunks of England, you totally can, right? You can do any of that stuff that you very, very, very well so choose. Now, the thing about it, though, in general, is, like I said, they're not required, but let's talk a little bit about who the Vikings are and kind of give some meat to the bones that we discussed in class, right? We started talking about a lot of different stuff. Pierre, can you get your head out of the pillowcase, please? Sorry, he's dressed right now like he's in his Halloween costume. He's dressed like a unicorn right now. Come here, buddy. Can you show the girls that your outfit? Come here. I know my honors G period girls would be so excited to see you. Come here. Come here, buddy. Come on. You ain't gotta be shy. Come here. So big thing about it though, as you can tell, he is dressed in his unicorn outfit for Halloween. Now the big thing about it though, when we're looking at this, let's talk a little bit about those Vikings, right? Yes, show it off for them. So going into it, something that you need to understand is who are these Vikings, right? Who are these people? Where are they coming from? What's the big deal about them, right? Why do they get entire videos and eras in European history dedicated to them? Well, the reason why is because that they are a very, very unique culture, right? They're a militaristic, which means like Sparta-like, right? Society from Scandinavia, okay? Now, if you don't know where Scandinavia is, you might want to go ahead and write a couple of those parts down. Scandinavia is actually the Nordic countries that you would refer to as basically being like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and little bits of Finland, right? Now, the thing we need to understand about the Vikings, though, is that why are they so important? Why do they have entire chunks of European history dedicated to their culture and their history? Well, the biggest thing about them that you need to kind of highlight and put a big star next to, make it look like it's exploding, or maybe draw a beard on it. I don't know if it's a Viking era thing. Big thing you need to understand, though, is their raids, right? Their raids and colonization efforts caused the growth of this thing known as the feudal system, which we'll talk about here in a couple of minutes, okay? Now, looking at the growth and their raids and stuff like that, the Lindisfarne raid is kind of where we actually start the Viking era of European history, okay? And that's that thing we talked about in class. Lindisfarne had a monastery on it. It was on the eastern coast of England, right? On a very small island, and this very large monastery had gold and relics and other Catholic reliquary inside of it, and also quite a bit of silver and lots of money. So, of course, the Vikings came over, raided the entire monastery, took all of the stuff, killed the monks that resided there, and then took all that stuff back home. Because something you need to understand about Vikings is there are two different types of, like, Viking practices, right? One is the raids, in which they come and take your stuff and they go back home, and the other one is the colonization efforts. So a lot of these Vikings that lived in a lot of these different areas of, like, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they lived in areas that didn't really have crazy amounts of good farmland. It was like sandy and stuff like that, and they didn't have access to a lot of like earth to actually create farms and land and create like a really, really good solid kingdom-style structure. So a lot of them are actually going to go out there and start colonizing a lot of areas, right? So these are the Viking homelands, and all these areas are like Viking settlements. Now, when we talk about the Vikings and stuff like that in general, it's not like they were making massive great halls everywhere. This right here is kind of a recreation of what a Viking settlement might look like, right? But basically, it was like a very barbarian-like settlement that they would actually grow their influence. And then all these different little areas had kings and lords of their own different lands and things like that. So when we're looking at this also, this is the early Middle Ages, y'all. This is the era of like petty kingdoms in Europe, where basically like if you just have enough land and enough people live on it, they might call you king, right? Because they don't have really like large, grandiose perceptions of how large the areas that they live in were. Pierre, you're gonna mess up all the clothes that I folded. Calm down, buddy. Just enjoy your costume. So the big thing, though, that we need to understand when we're looking at this is they just didn't have a perception of how big the island of England was. So a lot of these, there was like several different kings, and it made it actually very easy for the Vikings to raid, destroy, pillage, and take whatever they wanted from these smaller petty kingdoms, right? Now, the other big thing that you need to understand about it, it is going to lead to the growth of larger kingdoms, okay? Because the thing about it is a lot of these petty kingdoms are going to have to consolidate to fight the Vikings off, right? So when we look at people like Charlemagne was able to keep most of the chunk of middle of Europe under the Frankish kingdom, all of this stuff kept it very protected from the Vikings because he actually controlled a very large amount of land and had a very large army, right? Charlemagne, don't forget that guy. Him and Clovis are kind of those early representations of large-based kings, right? But larger kingdoms are going to be able to protect themselves from these Viking raids and from these challenging raids from other different groups of people that also include the Saxons and things like that. Oh, wow, that was a good burp. Now, look, getting into it, though, also that you need to understand is that they're going to do a lot of other really big stuff as well. Towards the end of the Viking era of Europe, you're going to see them even try to colonize North America. That's right! Under the guy named Leif Erikson, who is actually son of a very, very important Viking king known as Eric the Red, right? Eric the Red, his son, Leif Erikson, right? See that whole lineage line there? Erikson, you literally got named after your father's name if you were a son and stuff like that, or a boy in the Viking era. But Leif Erikson actually went out on a colonization effort to make his own money and make his own land, stuff like that, and he actually ran aground into areas like Greenland and then bopped around all the way as far as North America. So when you're looking at this, the Vikings actually started out and discovered North America 500 years. Well, they didn't discover, there were people already living there, but they literally explored areas of North America 500 years before Columbus ever even got there, right? So where do you see them in the modern day? Just a couple little things that we talked about in class. You see the Bluetooth symbol, right? Harald Bluetooth being the Viking king that, of course, united all the areas of Denmark together. And, of course, Bluetooth technology named after him. And the symbol on your phone is Viking runes for Harald Bluetooth combined together. But when we're looking at this, the whole idea was he combined the Viking kingdoms so you can combine your devices together using Bluetooth, right? And the other thing about it, too, though, is the days of the week in Norse mythology. You see a lot of Norse mythology run around still to this day because you see guys like this in Marvel movies. Of course, none other than Thor, right? Thor Odinson, right? The guy that, of course, is the god of thunder and lightning. And the other big thing about it that you also see as well is you see some of the days of the week, right? Some of the days of the week are actually named after Viking king or Viking gods, right? For example, because it's actually related to Old English, because there for a long time, the Vikings actually took over a huge chunk of the middle of England, and then it's going to eke its way into the English language, right? And so what you're going to see, though, is like Tuesday is Tyr's Day, their god of war. Wednesday is Woden's Day, the Anglo-Saxon word for Odin. You're going to see Thursday is Thor's Day. You're going to see Friday, which is Freya's Day, right? So several days of the week are actually even named after Viking gods, right? So going into it, though, speaking of those raids and stuff like that, though, to protect yourself from these Vikings, a lot of lords and a lot of kings and a lot of nobles throughout Europe are going to start realizing we need to consolidate our land together and we need to start protecting ourselves, right? We need to actually start making it so we have, like, feudal lands that can actually keep and prevent a Viking invasion, or else we're going to end up like the Lindisfarne monks and we're all going to end up dead and they're going to take all of our money, our women, and our stuff, right? So this right here is the feudal system, okay? So it's another chart that you're going to need to know, much like you need to know the ones in, like, for Rome and stuff like that. But this is your chart for this unit, right? So looking at it, though, the feudal system, not as clean as the Roman government, right? Not as symmetrical, not as easy, but it does represent the Middle Ages very well. Now, if you were to Google the feudal system online right now, you would see a lot of triangles. Now, Mr. Terry has changed his a little bit because he believes that it's a better and more accurate representation of what the feudal system actually would have been. So when we're looking at this, you have to understand the feudal system congregated people onto simple plots of land. The king would actually exist above everyone else, would regulate the entire system, and then would also bring in taxes to keep the entire kingdom or this area running. Now, every single one of these triangles right here is known as a fief, right? And a fief is a plot of land, okay? It's a land that the king would actually bestow on a very specific family, giving them rights and title over the land itself. So every single triangle is a fief, and that family that would be given that land, given that title, are lands that are like families that you would know as lords or nobles, okay? So just so we're looking at this and understand this correctly, what a lord and noble is just a family that's been given special title and lands by the king themselves. For example, you can see a lot of these people running around different areas of European history. You probably ran into a bunch of their titles before. Duke, Baron, Earl, Noble, Lord, all those things, for example, as well. Scott Disick, who used to be married into the Kardashian family and stuff like that, is literally a lord in England because he bought a bunch of land in England. Or you can also see as well people like Sir Elton John. If he was given title, okay, right, he was knighted by the Queen, and if he was actually given enough land, he would be a lord inside of like actual England. Now, they are the ones who own that land, right, because they were blessed and bestowed upon it by the king themselves. Now, who actually protects that land from Viking invasion are the people known as knights and vassals, okay? Knights and vassals are basically usually like second sons of lords and noble families that are militarily trained, and they can actually keep themselves protected from an invasion from the Vikings, right? If you see them long ships rolling up, the vassals assemble, the knights assemble, and they'll actually like help like fight those people off for you. And then 75% of Europe at this time were known as serfs, okay? Now, serfs are very, very important because we need to understand one key thing about them. There's a difference between slavery and economic indentured servitude, okay? Now, what serfs are economic indentured servants, okay? So something that we need to understand is that a lot of people sometimes refer to serfs as slaves, but they're actually not slaves, okay? Serfs are actually not, or like, cannot be bought and sold by lords and nobles. They are simply bound to the land by a contract, right? You see these actually in the modern era running around when you see lease agreements, right? The person who owns the property, who leases it to you, is known as your landlord, right? And that lease is a contract talking about how much money you will pay to keep that land for a certain time. Well, the serfs don't have any money, though, okay? And like 75% of you, if you lived in Europe at this time, would be a serf, a laborer on a large plot of land or on one of these fiefs. Now, what you do to the lord so you can stay is you sign that contract and agree to a work for a certain amount of time. So you give your labor to the system. The vassals provide military service. Now, notice really quickly, we got two arrows going for the vassals, okay? The vassals provide military service to the lords to protect from raiders and invaders and people like Vikings and stuff like that. But also, if the king decides that he wants to go to war, he calls up the lords and nobles, right? Calls the lords and nobles up and he says, send me your vassals, right? And they assemble what is known at the time as a feudal military, and then they march off to invade another kingdom. Now, lords, what they provide in the entire essence of the entire feudal system are the taxes, okay? They pay taxes to the king because they sell different kind of crops and goods that the serfs have actually farmed. They give a small lump of it back to the serfs so they can survive and live, and the lords will pay taxes to the king, and the system keeps going round and round and round and round and round. So when we're looking at that feudal system, though, it's wildly important. Do me a favor, go ahead and make sure you pause this if you need an extra second to jot that down, but otherwise, we're going to keep going, all right? So let's keep attacking this flip and keep getting after it. But that really mostly encompasses the early Middle Ages. So now what we're moving into is the period of time where there's a little bit more written, like recording history, known as the High Middle Ages. So we're now, like, some of you are probably like, wow, we moved through the early Middle Ages like really fast. Well, yeah, we did move through the early Middle Ages really fast because you don't need time to dawdle too much. We don't have a lot of written history lying around from the early Middle Ages, so all we really know are just a couple of big themes about the early Middle Ages. That being, of course, that Rome falls. We're going to see the resettlement of Europe by barbarian tribes. We're going to see some barbarian chieftains rise into the role of kings and control militaries. We're going to see the Viking era of Europe pop up, and then we're going to see, of course, the consolidation of kingdoms further, and then we're going to eke our way into, after the feudal system is established, into the High Middle Ages. Now, the High Middle Ages is really important, and let's talk really quickly about why it's referred to as such. The thing about the High Middle Ages is, what it means is that Europe is beginning to emerge, okay? It's the era of time between about 1000 and 1300 AD when Western Europe, that area that used to be the Western Roman Empire, is beginning to emerge from like the chaos of the fall of Rome, okay? They're actually emerging economically, politically, and socially. So you're seeing more money being made, you're seeing political representation become a little bit more systematic and a little bit more efficient, and you're also seeing the social aspects of Europe beginning to take form. Traditions, languages, barriers, boundaries of modern-day countries are beginning to actually occur during that High Middle Ages period. Now, looking at this right over here as well, you're seeing the feudal system, speaking of economically emerging High Middle Ages tendencies, you're seeing the feudal system actually kind of become even more refined. You're seeing it actually become even more broad-based. We got a vassal right here standing there with an arrow protecting these serfs who are farming the land, and of course the lord would live in that manor house back there. So something that you need to understand is that the feudal system is becoming so entrenched into European culture by this point that it is oftentimes during the High Middle Ages also referred to as the manor system, okay? The manor system is actually when the feudal system began to keep expanding and expanding and expanding, and some of these lords and nobles didn't just actually control plots of land that were worked by serfs, they controlled entire villages that were inhabited by serfs, and their lands were very far-reaching. You can actually see the manor system a little bit more efficiently in an actual graph like this, right? So the actual village itself, or actually where all of the serfs, commoners, and all the other people who would actually farm and do most of the agricultural work would be at a very, very small base underneath a very large hill where the manor itself would actually be on top. Sometimes this manor would be considered what you would refer to as a castle. That right there is actually a castle because you can see that it's protected by a wall, okay, making it actually a castle in a fortified area. But the manor system is beginning to expand, and anytime you actually hear me say manor system or feudal system or anything of the like, it's usually pretty much the same thing. So just know, manor system, feudal system, words that we can use interchangeably, okay? But the biggest thing about that you need to understand about the High Middle Ages is who is growing in power, okay? Now, the kings and rulers and lords and, all the vassals and the feudal system, cohabitants, if you will, of the High Middle Ages are still there, and they're still pretty powerful. But no one was growing as powerful as the Catholic Church, okay? The Catholic Church was actually beginning to really flex its muscles during the High Middle Ages and beginning to grow very, very powerful and very, very strong because the Catholic Church survived that fall of Rome, right? We know that they actually were established before the fall of Rome because the Christianity was legalized by Constantine in 313 AD with the actual Edict of Milan. But the Catholic Church is going to survive that fall of Rome. And then it also survives the schism as well. And so now officially by this point, they are known as the Roman Catholic Church, and politically their power is beginning to grow very, very quickly. And they kind of a lot of the High Middle Ages time periods are defined by the power, the growth, and the large ruling potential, okay, if you will, of the Catholic Church itself. Now, the power and importance of the Catholic Church during the High Middle Ages cannot be understated because literally they actually organized entire communities. Every single person went to Mass multiple times a day, and also they collected a tax every single week from you that made them very, very strong, very, very wealthy. Now, there's a few things you probably already know about, yes, by the way, this is a title, okay? This is a pretty solid overarching title, a big title, not a big, big title, like the High Middle Ages was a massive title. This one's kind of a solid title, right? And we're going to use this remaining time to talk about the growth and the power and the importance of the Catholic Church during the High Middle Ages. So getting into it though, what are some things we already know? Now the first three things in this, you don't need to write down. You go to a Catholic school, y'all study Catholic saints and stories and proverbs and parables, and you actually have religion class with Mr. Madrano and Mr. Mathern, and they do a very good job of teaching you these things, right? You don't need to write down who leads the Catholic Church because it was the exact same during the Middle Ages. It's the Pope, right? And you're going to see multiple different popes represent either very, very strong political aspects of the Catholic Church during the High Middle Ages. You're also going to see some ones that we don't really talk about that much because they didn't do a huge amount, okay? But now you're also going to see, though, that there are other leaders as well, and this is something, again, that y'all already know because you interact with it in the New Orleans area and in the New Orleans diocese. There are other leaders within the Catholic Church, including cardinals and bishops and priests and things like that, kind of a hierarchy or a bureaucracy of the Catholic Church that's beginning to really, really take shape and solidify itself during the High Middle Ages. Now, you're also going to see, though, figures and icons that are going to be heavily used, especially during the medieval period of the Catholic Church. Figures and icons and stories, of course, that were in heavy use in the Catholic faith are, of course, known as the saints of the Catholic Church. You're going to see several of them actually begin to pop up, and you're going to see a lot of their stories begin to solidify themselves during the High Middle Ages. And you also have to understand something else that's pretty crazy. Do y'all know there's over 200,000 saints? 200,000 saints, right? That's crazy. That's how many people have been canonized by the Catholic Church. And you're also going to see their stories actually really, really adhere to the High Middle Ages, and a lot of these saints are actually going to pop up during the High Middle Ages. For example, St. Patrick, right? St. Patrick's a very saint that actually a very, very famous saint that popped up during the High Middle Ages that is actually going to be the one known for chasing all the snakes out of Ireland. But the snakes don't represent snakes, they actually represent paganism, and he actually converted Ireland to Christianity. Also, other saints are going to be very famous for converting the Vikings. The Vikings are actually going to convert pretty much wholesale by 1050 AD, that most of them are actually going to convert to Christianity. And their conversion to Christianity actually kind of marks the, the end of the Viking era. And Mackenzie Ori and I were actually talking about this in class. And it's actually funny because a lot of Norse mythology wasn't really, really heavily recorded until the Vikings actually converted to Christianity, and then the Catholic Church got involved and started writing a lot of it down, right? Because the Vikings didn't actually record history a lot like that. Now, really, really quick, these last two things you probably need to go ahead and jot down just because they're important to your understanding and the growth of the Catholic faith. How often do you think that people went to church during the High Middle Ages? Well, I'll go ahead and tell you, 2 to 3 times a day. So you went every single day, 2 to 3 times a day. At bare minimum, you usually went to confession almost every single day, or a small mass or something like that. And Sunday Mass was usually the largest event where the entire villager community would come together and they would all share Mass together. But 2 to 3 times a day, which is actually really intense, because a lot of y'all probably only go on Sundays if you go at all, okay? So now it's a very, very interesting thing, though, to kind of see how the Catholic Church was ingrained into the Middle Ages society. Now, this is also huge as well. What language was the Bible only written in during this time period, during an era where literacy was really low? Because because by the High Middle Ages, we know that literacy rates have gotten up to about 4% after the Carolingian Renaissance and after Charlemagne took it from 2% to 4%. Now, the only language the Bible was written in, though, was in Latin. Okay, now we don't know for sure if this was a political power play, if they wanted to keep it that way, because the number of people that even spoke Latin, let alone read Latin, was very, very limited and small, or if it was just kind of tradition and it just kind of kept going forward. We're not really positive. There's a lot of argumentative status between historians about this idea. But another thing that you need to understand, though, is that also Mass was even in Latin. And also, Mass wasn't just in Latin, so you literally went to Mass and you didn't understand what the priest was saying, but you, of course, were expected to go every Sunday. And then also, not only this, but the priest faced this way. You saw his back the entire time. And he faced the altar and actually served Mass, not facing you whatsoever. So as you can tell, there's a couple little things about the Catholic Church. Right? We talked about the things that are really, really similar to the modern-day Catholic Church, which is up there at the top, of course, being like the popes and the cardinals and the priests and the bishops and all that stuff. And then, of course, also the saints being of heavy use, because I know that all y'all pick a saint when you get confirmed and stuff like that. But the other thing about it, though, that you need to understand is that, yeah, the Catholic Church Mass was in Latin, and then also, of course, as well, you went 2 to 3 times a day, and that was expected of you. So the High Middle Ages Church, or the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, is beginning to show its kind of like intense differences. Now, let's start small, though. If we're talking about the small-based Catholic Church and aspects about the Catholic Church that are actually kind of local, you, one-to-one every day, if most of you would have been serfs, about 75% of Europe during the High Middle Ages were serfs, you would actually usually live in a village. So how would the church affect your life in the village, right? So in the manor system, most areas most manors actually had a church. For example, this one is one that was built during the High Middle Ages, and it still stands in rural Britain today. And then, of course, as you can see, a big part of the manor system is, of course, the church being located inside of the actual village. Now, these churches are ran by what you would refer to as a parish priest, okay? A parish priest is going to be sent there by maybe a local bishop or the larger city, and you would run, your entire area would be ran, or your entire parish would be ran by this one priest. Now, the simple importance of the Catholic Church and why it was so important to the growth of the Middle Ages is, of course, first of all, you got to receive your sacraments, right? It's the area which every single person went to receive their 7 big sacraments, including marriage, baptism. Now, burial is not actually a sacrament, but I include it on here because it was considered at the time that you could not actually go to heaven if you were not buried in hallowed ground, all right? But also they regulated holy days, right, aka holidays, of course, where the word itself comes from. Holiday, hence holy day of obligation, right? An era of time where you wouldn't actually work. Now, funny enough, there's this little thing that goes around the internet all the time that says there were over 150 holidays that was regulated by the Catholic Church because they wanted to keep serfs happy. So it was these eras where they wouldn't work, and it's how the idea that we work now more days than a medieval peasant would. That's a little bit of a loaded term, though, because you got to understand, life during the Middle Ages, you had to work to survive, right? So you might not work for the Lord on a holiday, but you're definitely working back at your house and farming your own stuff and keeping your animals alive and doing all these other things that we wouldn't really consider at the time work. It's just surviving, right? But I think it's just important to throw that out there because a lot of these memes right here are running around. And they're over-exaggerating things a little bit, right? But the thing about it, though, is that the church did actually regulate those holidays and stuff like that. Now, the host and the transubstantiation is going to be really big as well, because when you were living in a village, it's where you went to your village church to receive the host. You actually would like to receive the Eucharist, and it's really, really important because that was considered to be one of the most important sacraments that you had to receive every single week. Now, there was also a political importance to the village church as well. The biggest one that you need to highlight right now is actually a very, very important one, the tithe, right? So something that was created and started in the Middle Ages was the habitual and rhythmic, if you will, donation of the tithe. And what the tithe is the tax you had to pay to the church every single Sunday, okay? You were expected to pay a church tax every single Sunday, known as the tithe. And the tithe, of course, is a 10% tax that you had to donate. So whatever you made in a week, 10% of it went to the church, which is that's a significant chunk of your income. Now, think about this, though, really, really quickly. The bulk of the European continent by this point has converted to Catholicism. So if the entirety of all these village churches are collecting this tithe from all these different villages and then accruing it all together, and most of it's going back to Rome, the Catholic Church is making an obscene amount of money. And during the High Middle Ages, as economics are beginning to increase, the Catholic Church is making even more money than they ever could have imagined, right? And then think about it when we go into the Renaissance, they're going to make even more, okay? Because notice that thing is a 10%. It's not a flat rate. Now, the other big thing about it, though, that we'll talk about in class, of course, is even dealing out justice. If you were ever accused of a crime, you actually were, basically held on trial by your local parish priest. That's why the village was actually so important in people's lives. So we'll talk about that stuff a little bit in class, though. We'll talk about what an ordeal is and how, there were basically, physical tests to see if you actually committed a crime, and they were actually ran and officiated by the Catholic Church. But we'll talk about that stuff a little bit later on when I see y'all next. I think it's on Tuesday, right? Boo-Boo Day. We'll talk about some stuff, but look, I need y'all to do me a favor. Come in ready to learn. I know it's Boo-Boo Day, but you got to come in ready to learn because we got stuff to do, okay? It's honors, no days off. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.